Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, helping people take their leadership to the next level. Brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International.
Well, Richard, it's always a pleasure to sit across from you and talk.
I'm sure it is, Sam. Live from Blackaby Studios.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, it's always fun to sit down and do these things. And
yeah, we're not quite yet Warner Brothers, but we're on the way.
Well, yeah, we're nipping at the heels.
Maybe I'll do a like animated feature next, I think.
Yeah. Maybe you could do some hand sketches. And,
yeah.
Well, if your pun.
Puns.
Rampage is any.
My daughter tells me they're the lowest form of humor, but if any of you follow me on Facebook or Twitter,
I don't think she's wrong. Let's put it that way.
It's an acquired taste. And puns, but yeah.
I'm sure it is.
If you follow me on social media, I've been putting a daily pun out lately, and I've gotten some great responses and quite a few groans.
Yeah,
I'm not quite sure where that's coming from.
Probably more groans than great responses. Well, Richard, it's been a minute since we've done a book review.
It has.
Probably closer to 2 months, actually. We try and do this
extended minute.
Yeah. Extra innings. We try and do this about once a month. We do a leadership book review.
Yeah, because I have a lot of people always asking me about what leadership books do I read and what do I recommend, and this is just a chance in a broader way to just share some of the books that I'd encourage you to read if you want to study up on leadership.
Yeah, and we've had a lot of great responses to these episodes, and we've sort of started with the classics way back, and we've been inching our way up
into the 21st century.
Into the 21st century. I think we've just scraped into the 21st century with this one, and it is the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. So why don't you tell us why we picked this book today?
Well, Patrick Lincioni has written a series of books, and this one will highlight the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, but he's written several others, and he has a unique style in that he writes a leadership fable. It's a fictional account that has all kinds of very real parts to it that sound very much like what really does happen in real organizations and leadership teams. And so the first part is a very interesting fable, he calls it, but as you watch a leader trying to address real issues, he teaches us along the way about how to do it. And I like his approach. If you haven't read some of his stuff, I think some people just give me the straight goods. And
do A, B, and C.
At the end of the book, he kind of will do a bit of that in review. But I like his style because some people, it's a fictional book. It's the truths are kind of lost, deeply embedded somewhere in the story. But here, it's very obvious. It's a new CEO that's come in, or different situations, and they're inheriting a very dysfunctional leadership team or organization, and then he just sort of tells how the person goes about changing it, making it better.
Yeah, and I really love that. This is actually the first Lincioni book that I've read, and that really stood out to me. That it
keeps your attention, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's unlike any other leadership book, but it also makes it more memorable, which is what I love about stories. And we've talked about this before. Yeah, is how stories have a way of impacting us that just the statistics and the data just doesn't. Yeah. And so I really appreciated that.
And what I find with this approach too is that, sometimes a leader can say, or a writer can say, well, a good leader, when you're trying to turn an organization around, will do these 6 things. And number 1, number 2, and they all may be true. But a story actually shows you what it would look like if you were doing it. And it shows you the pushback and the opposition and the people that ultimately you have to fire, or the people that come on board. And, and so he makes it complex. He makes it real to life, where it's not just real easy. And even the leader themselves at times will second guess themselves, or they'll realize, I shouldn't have probably said that, or I shouldn't have been so strong there. And and so it's portrayed as a very real life kind of situation, and you see someone who's actually trying to apply these principles with real people, and it's never as clean cut as just here's 6 things that you do. I might just say I don't have all of his books. I've heard Lincioni speak in person a couple of times, and he's written a number of other books. The books I've got of his also is one called The 4 Obsessions of an Extraordinary Executive. He's got one called Getting Naked. It's for you think it's too risque. It's about shedding the 3 fears that sabotage client loyalty. And so just this one in particular, just saying so many times when working with clients, we're so afraid that if we're really honest with them and straightforward, that we could lose them as a customer and that kind of thing. And showing the power of just being upfront and honest and with integrity and so on. And then there's also one, I love this other title too. I think it's maybe the first one I read, called Death by Meeting. And I love that. Just if anyone, and there's a great picture of a guy sitting at the end of the table with his head on the table. And you look, I think everyone can identify with having been in meetings like that one.
Yeah, and I think if anyone who's been listening to the podcast long knows that, Richard could wear that as a mantra over his door, Death by Meeting. Oh
boy, I tell you, there's. So, and some of those truths actually show up in this book we just wanted to highlight for a few minutes. It's The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And, of course, teamwork is so critical to successful, healthy organizations. And it's an art as well as a science. You wonder sometimes, why is it that you can have some leadership teams sitting around a boardroom table and they are just firing out great creative ideas, and they're solving problems, and they're all excited and animated, and they're eager to get to the work, and they're just bringing out all the creative juices of each other. And then you've got other teams that there's infighting, there's silos, there's hurt feelings. I've heard of lots of team meetings where people are storming out of the room, slamming the door. Sometimes even with Christian organizations, church
certainly
meetings.
Not church meetings, though.
People saying hurtful things, people very defensive if you even begin to comment about their particular area, meetings that you walk away from after having a mind-numbing hour or two in the room, and you're not sure that you accomplished anything.
Yeah, meetings that should have been an email.
Yeah, or a stand-up meeting and before at the beginning of the day, but. And so this particular book is addressing particularly what do you do with teams to make them dynamic and creative and unified and cohesive and loyal. And so the fictional story is about a woman named Catherine. She's been a CEO before, various industries, but she comes to this tech company that is in a great disarray. They have lots of money. They've got some great backing of investment capital. They've got some really creative people on the team, but they're underperforming and they're losing morale. And I think they're down to number 3 or so in their industry, even though on paper they should really be number 1. And so I think a lot of leaders have dealt with that. If you've ever been hired to lead, maybe you're a senior pastor and you come in and you've got some church staff, or you come into a business, you're made a manager at whatever level, and now you've got people that answer to you, and you may have inherited a team from a leader who was not very gifted at leading. And so the question is, where do you even begin? How do you transform? You're not going to suddenly have a great team by giving an impassioned speech your first day of work. Of course, everybody's going to be checking you out and wondering, where you come from and how seriously to take you, and what's the drum you're going to beat that they have to kind of learn how to dance to. It just kind of set up this particular book. There's several key people. There's Jeff, who actually was the founder of the company, was the former CEO. Brilliant person in many ways, but just not a good leader. He hired a lot of high-powered stallions, but he didn't know how to mold them into a team.
Yeah.
Sometimes we think, well, just hire the best people available. But even if you've ever played on a sports team, sometimes you get a bunch of superstars, and that's not a team.
Yeah, that doesn't necessarily make a winning team.
No, just a bunch of people all trying to get on the highlight reel with their own personal performance and their own statistics. And so Jeff has sort of done that, and finally the board steps in and asks him not to be the CEO, so that's kind of complicated. When Catherine comes in, you have the founder of the company, the former CEO, on the executive team, and he's been demoted. And so that's one of the people she has to work with. Mikey is in charge of marketing, brilliant again person, but the sales are way down, and she has a reputation of being really good at what she does, but she will complain, well, it's the products or it's other parts of the business. How can I market things that don't exist, and so on. Martin is the chief technologist. He's the engineer type, the guy that's maybe not the most personable, just down to business, and doesn't understand all this warm, feeling, fuzzy stuff. Just tell me what needs to get done.
Yeah.
JR is in charge of sales, and sales are in bad shape, but he's a high-powered guy with lots of charisma and people sort of person. And so, again, you look at all the different performers on the team and you think this should be knocking it out of the park every week with the kind of horsepower we've got here. Carlos is in charge of customer support. He's one of those kind of good old guys that is just always willing to pitch in and help out. And then you got Jan, who's the chief financial officer, the number cruncher. And of course, you always have one of those in most organizations, and they're worried about the bottom line and legal ramifications and liabilities and cost overruns and budgeting and cash flow. And so you're trying to turn things around. You're trying to get more customer awareness and so on, and yet you always have someone at the table. Well, what's that going to cost us? And then lastly, Nick is the chief operating officer. He's another person that's supposed to be giving some overall direction to the organization, but doesn't have very much to do right now. And so he's this high-powered guy trying to justify his job. And of course, that's the essence of a bureaucracy, is when you've got people trying to justify their jobs.
Yeah.
Instead of just results justifying their job. That ought to be the great justifier, is that you're getting results. But oftentimes you'll find a bureaucracy, an organization that's not actually producing very much, but everybody wants to let everyone else know how busy they are and how swamped they are with all their full schedules and activities and emails to answer. And so Nick is someone who's trying to justify his position. And again, the way this book is written, all these people are talented. They all know what they're doing. And yet, as a team, they're not performing well. And so Catherine comes in and has to try to turn things around. And she'll ultimately explain to the team that there's what she calls 5 dysfunctions to a team.
Yeah.
And 5 things that cause teams to be dysfunctional. And the first one, she says, or Lincioni says through Catherine, is absence of trust. You've got a bunch of people sitting around the table, but they don't trust each other. And so the first thing she'll have to do is try to help people just even get to know each other. A lot of times we make assumptions about people. If someone is maybe not great with people skills, we just label them, and we want to steer clear of them. They can tend to say rude things or off-color things, or some people just don't share much about themselves. Maybe they've been hurt in previous companies. They were vulnerable before, and it was used against them, and so now they're protecting themselves. So nobody wants to admit that maybe they're not getting the results that that everybody expects them to get. So you cover up for yourself. You put on the best light. You don't want to be honest. And so if you got a table full of people like that, all just wanting to make sure that they don't look like the weak performer, the weak link in the chain, then it's really hard to ever build a cohesive team. And that's, of course, why there's a lot of team building exercises. Catherine's going to do some of these off-sites where she takes her team for 2 days, and just begins to help them break down some things. And of course, it's fictional, but it's interesting. Lincioni develops this, and Catherine is looking to cause conflict. That's one of the things I thought was really interesting. She'll say one of the first things she notices is that there isn't any conflict, at least not easily discerned at first, because people are just playing it safe. They're not branching out. They're not saying what they're thinking necessarily. They know that if they criticize or appear to criticize someone else, then it could come back their way.
Yeah.
So everybody is just kind of putting in their time at the meeting. And so Catherine actually says, if you don't have anybody arguing their point, then you actually have an unhealthy team. If everybody just is agreeing or just rubber stamping, then you're not getting the best thinking out of your people. And obviously not a lot of buy-in. If they don't challenge anything, it's because they don't care. And they just want to hurry up and get the meeting over with, instead of being engaged in the topic and fully engaged in trying to find the best answers, and not being willing to let someone slough off with a half-hearted answer and saying, no, that's not acceptable. So a lot of us are trying to avoid conflict in meetings. She goes in and tries to stir it up a little bit.
Yeah.
And of course, the way she's portrayed, she's a nice enough person, and she bites her tongue a number of times. She's very intentional about what she does. She's very much in charge of the meetings, even though she asks questions and lets people speak out. She knows where she wants the meetings to go, which is very important.
Yeah.
She has a purpose for them. So it's interesting too. She says at one point, every staff meeting there'll be loads of conflict, and if there's nothing worth debating, then we're not having a real meeting. He thinks the only reason we meet is so we can debate and argue and discuss and challenge to try to find the best answer. Also a great quote was, if everything is important, then nothing is.
Yeah.
And so when you have a meeting, the reading of the minutes from last meeting is probably not the most crucial thing. But oftentimes we'll waste all kinds of time in parts of the meeting that aren't that important.
Yeah.
And then we don't have time to ever dig in and put our emotions into the parts of the meeting that are important. So that's also, I thought, a really great point.
Yeah, I think having a clear vision of the purpose of a meeting, I think that really seemed to shine through in the book, and also ring true for most people, that if everyone's been in a time wasting kind of meeting, and typically it's because there isn't a really clear purpose or result that we're looking for in a meeting. It's just sort of like, well, this is the team meeting time. And
it's on the schedule. We meet every month at this time.
Yeah.
She said something else that I thought was interesting. I keep saying she because Catherine is the main character in the book, but
it's Lincioni.
But they also say consensus is horrible. It becomes an attempt to please everyone. We just want to come to consensus, and in the book, she'll say, no, I don't. If I present something and everyone says, hey, is everybody okay with that? If they all say sure, you ought to be concerned about that. If no one asks any hard questions, no one pushes back and considers other alternatives, other approaches, wants some rationale for why we would do this, then you've got a team that just wants to get out of there. You don't have a team that's actually working together. It's healthy debate, vigorous debate. You're a healthy team when you can push and argue and debate a point, and then when the meeting's over, you go away as friends. And,
I like that because it really focuses on debating the issues and not the people. I think that's a pretty clear distinction, that you're wrestling with these ideas, these directions that different people think that organization should go. We're not debating like I like or dislike this person, or that person's dumb or whatever. It's wrestling with the ideas that are brought forth.
And unfortunately, a lot of times we have our own insecurities. And so if someone disagrees with my idea, they are belittling me, or I feel belittled.
Well, certainly, I think in today's society that there is a certain amount of identity wrapped up in your ideas. So if someone says that's not a good idea, then it's sort of internalized as like they don't think I'm a good idea.
Yeah, and I don't know, the younger generation that is becoming so fearful of and feeling that there's a microaggression against them if someone says something that they don't agree with or has a different perspective. I'm not sure how. It's probably going to be more challenging in the days to come to have a meeting where you put ideas out there. The universities today, you've got all kinds of college students who don't even want there to be a lecture going on anywhere on the university campus where ideas are being presented that they don't agree with.
Yeah.
If they're a very liberal-leaning student and there's a right-wing lecturer at the lecture hall over in the northeast corner of the campus, and they need to have a safe place to go because they feel threatened that there's ideas being shared that they find offensive, if that's the kind of graduates that are graduating from our universities and going into business school and into organizations, it's going to become even more challenging to forge a team where you still feel the freedom to push people. And in fact, the second dysfunction of a team, they say, is fear of conflict. And he goes on to say, teams that lack trust are incapable of engaging in unfiltered and passionate debate of ideas. Instead, they resort to veiled discussions and guarded comments. We're all afraid of putting off a time bomb. And some people have certainly worked with people like that maybe had anger issues, or they were very sensitive, very thin-skinned. And you know that some things could be better, but nobody has the courage to raise the question because we don't want to set that person off. Or last time that we questioned what this person was doing, they stormed out of the room with a tirade. And so let's leave that alone. And part of the problem is we think, well, that's their area anyway. I just need to be concerned with my area. And in this book, they go on to say, but we're a team. And if any one of us is not doing our area well, it is everyone else's business. It does affect them. You can't just say, well, because marketing is they're doing a horrible job, but over in production, we're doing a great job. So let's just focus on high quality products. Well, you'll go broke if it doesn't matter how good your product is if it's not being marketed well. So you do have a vested interest in how everyone else is doing their job. And that means you've got to not fear conflict if it means you need to ask some hard questions. And you're in a healthy organization when people can challenge people all around the table and question respectfully, but challenge and say, but why is that not done yet? And why have you not gotten that finished or met this deadline? And asking some hard questions sometimes it takes a healthy team to do that. If you're not healthy, every organization I've been around, most organizations have issues that just don't get addressed. No one ever wants to talk about it.
Right.
And so it holds organizations back month after month because we just don't want conflict. We value peace and tranquility more than being effective.
Right. Well, let's take a quick break here, and then when we come back, we'll look at the other 3 dysfunctions.
Bob Royal and Richard Blackaby recently wrote a book called Spiritual Leadership Coaching. It integrates the life-changing biblical insights from experiencing God with training in 12 essential coaching skills that will enhance your ability to have transformational conversations. Use the promo code PODCAST at checkout to receive an additional 10% off the book at blackabystore.org.
All right, Richard. So we saw the first 2 dysfunctions of a team. What's the third dysfunction that Lincioni lays out?
He says it's lack of commitment. And he goes on to say, without having aired their opinions in the course of passionate and open debate, team members rarely, if ever, buy in and commit to decisions, though they may feign agreement during meetings. So they don't think they've been heard. If they haven't, if you've not really wrestled with an issue, you don't have ownership of it, then you're not going to be committed to it. You're just going to go back to your silo and just kind of keep doing your job and just leave everyone else's work to them. And you're not a team. You're just a bunch of separate people all doing your own thing and just trying to do your job well. And but a team cares about what the whole team is doing, and they when they feel like they've had their say and they've had input, then they're committed now. Now they want the team to succeed, and you can always tell, the difference between a team full of superstar individuals and then a team that's playing for one another. And there's, of course, some great storylines of teams that, person by person, they didn't have the most talented team, but they were the strongest team as a team. And teams often will beat a group of star individuals.
Yeah.
So, and then the fourth one is avoidance of accountability. And he says, without committing to a clear plan of action, even the most focused and driven people often hesitate to call their peers on actions and behaviors that seem counterproductive to the good of the team. And I'll tell you what, that is a high level of teamwork where the other team members hold people accountable. And so when people said that they would have a report or a product ready by this time and it's not ready, instead of just kind of looking the other way or this awkward silence, someone speaks up and says, well, what are we going to do? Why did you not get this done? You knew the deadline. You knew when this had to be ready. Following up, and when people know ahead of time, but when I get to that meeting, they're going to ask me, is this done? A lot of churches won't do that. A lot of committees think if we just talk about things and then we all just go our separate ways till the next meeting, that somehow magically by talking about things will get done. But that's why when you have a meeting, you always need to say, before you leave the meeting, say, now, who's responsible for this? What will they have done? When will they have it done? And let's make sure that before we leave, everyone knows what they're accountable for. And
I've been even in one-on-one meetings with people who say, okay, before we leave, here are the things that I'm going to provide for you, or this is what I'm going to do. And it's amazing the difference that is.
Take just 5 minutes and say, let me make sure that we're clear on what you're going to be doing, what I'm going to be doing, when we're going to do it. That 5 minute, a lot of times you can have these really warm discussions with lots of good intentions. And you just think because we just felt so good and we were so open and both just really sincere that, boy, that was a great meeting. But you walk away and there's nothing to be held accountable to.
Yeah.
And so the best meetings, always you walk away knowing who's accountable for what. And then you've got a team that has the courage to hold people accountable and to say it's just not acceptable. I think we probably all work with people that just regularly don't get done what they were supposed to get done.
Yeah.
And so now a whole organization is held hostage because someone is disorganized, and they can complain about, well, I was just swamped. I had an aunt that had to go to her funeral this past month, or this or that, or I had a cold. And if you tolerate people not getting the job done, if you don't hold people accountable, then you create a culture where that's okay. Any excuse will do. And of course, you want to have some grace, but at the same time, you want to be held accountable. And to say if week after week, month after month, there's just a steady stream of excuses why you didn't get your job done, you don't have a healthy team. And if the boss has to always be the one who's holding people accountable, you also are not a healthy team.
Yeah.
A healthy team, everybody around the table starts jumping in and says, hey, wait a minute here. We all agreed last month that you would do that. And when the team starts holding other members accountable, now you know that you're getting to a culture of accountability and then effectiveness. And the last one is inattention to results. And he says it occurs when team members put their individual needs, such as ego, career development, or recognition, or even the needs of their divisions above the collective goals of the team. And again, at the end of the day, it's all about results. Organizations exist for results, to produce some kind of result. And a lot of times people can just be so focused on their little area or their individual career and their success and what they're doing that we somehow just keep making excuses for week after week where the results aren't happening. And certainly in churches, that happens. I've led church council meetings. Everybody gives their report. Everybody was busy. Everyone met. But the fact is the church isn't growing, or the church is declining, or we haven't reached anybody in our neighborhood. But we had lots of meetings. We're really busy. We're swamped. But whatever the result is you're trying to get is not being achieved.
Yeah.
And, today 70% of churches are plateaued or declining. and yet there's all kinds of meetings taking place.
Yeah.
And those churches continue to be plateaued or declining, and to say, well, wait a minute here, that would suggest to me that there's a bunch of church councils, deacons or elders boards that are meeting, but they're not an effective team, because the results aren't changing. Everyone's just trying to be polite and not make anyone put on the spot or feel embarrassed, but the results aren't there. And so ultimately, when you're a healthy team, you're going to also get productive results. And it's a great book. I think if you are someone that leads a team of any kind, it's a great read just
Definitely.
to see how to take, and you may not have a team as dysfunctional as this. Hopefully you don't. But I think all of us I think once a year at least, every leader that leads a team ought to read a book like this by Lincioni or someone else, and reflect on how your team works. What are your meetings like? In fact, he says an interesting thing at one point in the book. He says, what would you rather do, go to a meeting or go to a movie? And of course, everyone's like, I don't even care what the movie is. I'd rather go to that. And when he breaks it down, he says, well, it's because there's drama in a movie, and people find meetings boring. But Lincioni says, well, meetings ought to have drama. They ought to have conflict. There ought to be some conflict resolution that takes place in the meeting. It ought to be exciting. There ought to be high stakes in meetings. People ought to be engaged. And in a sense, there ought to be some drama and excitement and certainly some fulfillment after you've been to a meeting and you see all that was accomplished. And so for our listeners this week, even if you're having a family meeting with your kids, talking about what we're going to do for our vacation this summer, whether you're in a church council meeting, whether you're leading an executive team in your business, a lot of bad habits can creep in. And so you may have had a really dynamic team a while ago, but one bad apple can start to sour things. This CEO has to ultimately, lets two people go. It's kind of a mystery, because you figure someone at least is going to get fired before this is out. Some of the chief protagonists, you think, well, sometimes you get surprised. And some, the CEO realizes, well, they're very talented, but I can work with this, I can shape this. And then there's certain things that just you can't tolerate if you're going to ever have a healthy team. And that's one of the things a lot of leaders agonize over is, well, do I fire this person, or how many chances should I give them? Yeah. And I was even just talking with a pastor not long ago that was agonizing over having to let a team member go. But everything that he told me about the team member and the negative result on the team indicated you had no other choice. It was every week you left this person in place was costing everyone else on the team. So lots of issues to do with building a healthy team, and certainly one that any leader needs to be constantly giving some thought to, so that your team is productive and unified and getting the job done.
Well, Richard, thank you so much for enlightening us once again on another great leadership book. And I really enjoyed this one. And speaking of leadership books, what do we have coming up for our next book review?
I thought we'd go back. It's kind of a bit of a classic again, a little bit older one, but one I think that's become a standard. Is by Richard Swinson, called Margin. Okay. And I think certainly in our day, it's still a very relevant message. And so we'll have that in the show notes. But if you haven't read that book, it's been out for a little while, but I think still pretty well standard on how to put margin in your life so you're not maxed out all the time.
Yeah, something we can all use a little more.
Yeah, I need to review that regularly.
Me too. Well, great, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, review us on Apple Podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. If you have questions or comments, please email us at podcast@blackaby.org.